There's a sound that a farmer never forgets. It's not the sound of the fire itself. Fire is quiet at first, just a crackle, almost gentle, like kindling in a wood stove. The sound a farmer never forgets is the sound of the thing that starts the fire. The sound of lightning hitting a building at 2 in the morning. A crack so loud and so close that it doesn't sound like thunder. It sounds like the world breaking. Warren Platt heard that sound on July 14, 1971, and he knew before he opened his eyes, before his feet hit the bedroom floor, before he pulled back the curtain and saw the orange glow where his barn should have been. He knew that his life had just been divided into two halves, everything before this moment and everything after. Warren was 38 years old. He'd farmed 200 acres in Fillmore County, Nebraska since 1960, when his father retired and handed him the land, the house, the equipment, and a handshake that meant more than any contract. 11 years of work, 11 years of building, a modest farm, well-run, debt-free. Because Warren's father had taught him the same thing every father in this county taught his son. Never owe more than you can pay if the worst year of your life happens tomorrow. The worst year of his life happened that night. The lightning hit the barn at 2:14 in the morning. Warren knew the exact time because the clock in the kitchen stopped when the power line caught fire. The bolt had traveled from the barn roof along the wire to the house. The barn was fully engulfed in under 3 minutes. Dry hay, dry wood, diesel fuel in the tractor bay, grease on the shop floor. The building went up like it had been waiting for permission. Warren got his wife June and his daughter Ellie, 7 years old, asleep in the back bedroom, out of the house in their pajamas. They stood in the front yard and watched the barn burn. The heat was so intense they could feel it from 100 yards. The flames lit the entire property orange. You could see it from 3 miles away. 2 neighbors arrived within 20 minutes, but there was nothing to do. The barn was gone. The workshop attached to the barn was gone. The grain bins, 12,000 bushels of stored wheat from last year's harvest, which Warren had been holding for a better price, were burning. The combine, stored in the barn, was burning. 1 tractor, a John Deere 320, was burning. Then the house caught. The fire traveled along the power line, ignited the attic insulation, and within an hour the house was gone too. Warren, June, and Ellie stood in the driveway in their pajamas and watched 30 years of family history turn to smoke. By dawn, the fire had burned itself out. What remained was ash, concrete foundations, twisted metal roofing, the chimney standing alone like a broken finger pointing at the sky, and the shell of a grain bin that looked like a crushed tin can. And one other thing. Warren's second tractor, a 1964 Farmall 560, had been parked in the open, about 50 yards east of the barn, next to the fuel tank. Warren had left it there the night before because he'd been greasing the front axle and hadn't finished. He'd planned to put it back in the barn in the morning. He never got the chance. And that accident, leaving the tractor outside one night because of a grease job he didn't finish, saved the only piece of equipment on the farm. The Farmall's paint was scorched. The seat cushion had melted from the radiant heat. The rubber on the steering wheel was warped. The wiring harness was damaged, but the engine was intact. The hydraulics were intact. The transmission was intact. Warren walked over to it at dawn, climbed up on the bare metal seat frame and turned the key. The engine turned over on the second try. The Farmall 560 burned, blistered, ugly as sin was running, the only working machine on a farm that no longer existed. Warren sat on that tractor for a long time, listening to the engine idle, looking at the ruins of everything he'd built. June was sitting on the tailgate of a neighbor's pickup, wrapped in a blanket, crying quietly. Ellie was asleep on the front seat of the same pickup, curled around a stuffed rabbit that she'd grabbed during the evacuation, the one thing she'd saved. Then the insurance man came. His name was Howard Brill. He worked for Great Plains Mutual out of Lincoln. He arrived 3 days after the fire in a company sedan, wearing a suit that had no business being on a farm, carrying a clipboard and a folder of forms, and the particular expression of a man who has done this before and knows how it ends. Howard walked the property with Warren. He noted the foundations. He noted the grain bins. He noted the destroyed equipment. He took photographs with a Polaroid camera, each one showing a different angle of the same story. Total destruction. They sat at a folding table that a neighbor had set up in the yard. The Platts were living in a neighbor's spare room while they figured out what came next, and Howard opened his folder. "Mr. Platt," he said, "the policy on the structures covers $15,200. That's the barn, the house, the workshop, and the bins. The equipment policy covers an additional $8,300 for the combine and the John Deere. The grain is covered under a separate provision for $4,200. Total payout, $27,700. Warren nodded. He'd expected something in that range. The policy was old, written in '62 when the house was worth less and the barn was smaller. He'd never updated it. That was his mistake, and he knew it. "The assessed value of the land is $42,000, Howard continued. "At current prices, you could sell the 200 acres for around $50,000. Between the insurance payout and the land sale, you'd walk away with approximately $77,000. That's enough for a fresh start, a house in town, maybe a small business." He pushed a form across the table. "This is the total loss settlement. Sign here, and we'll have a check to you within 30 days. Warren looked at the form. He looked at the number. He looked at the ruins of his farm, still smelling of smoke and wet ash. "What if I don't sell?" Warren said. Howard blinked. In his experience, this question didn't get asked. When a farm burned to the ground, the farmer sold. That was the equation. Fire plus insurance plus land sale equals new life somewhere else. It was clean, logical, and final. "Mr. Platt, there's nothing left to farm with. You have no buildings, no equipment except a damaged tractor, no stored grain, and I'm being frank with you, a 200-acre farm that needs at least $60,000 in infrastructure just to operate. Your insurance covers $27,000. That leaves a $33,000 gap. Where are you going to find $33,000? "I'm not going to find $33,000, Warren said. "I'm going to find $400. Howard looked at him the way a doctor looks at a patient who refuses treatment. Concerned, professional, and certain that the outcome would be bad. $400, Howard repeated. "That's what I have in cash. June has $112 in her household account. We'll call it $500. I can work with $500. You can't rebuild a farm with $500. I'm not going to rebuild a farm. I'm going to start one. There's a difference." Howard Brill shook his head, tucked the unsigned form back into his folder, and drove away. He told the Lincoln office that the Platt claim would remain open. He expected Warren to call within 60 days and sign the settlement. Warren never called. Now let me tell you why. Because the reason is standing in the ashes in her bare feet. The night of the fire, while the barn was still burning and June was crying and the neighbors were arriving, Ellie had woken up in the pickup truck where someone had placed her. She'd climbed out, still in her pajamas, still holding her rabbit, and walked toward her father, who was standing alone, watching the house burn. She'd tugged on his hand. Warren looked down. "Daddy," Ellie said, "are we going to lose the farm?" She was 7. She didn't know what insurance was, or what a settlement meant, or what total loss translated to in the language of adults who had given up. She knew one thing. This was her home. The fields where she chased butterflies, the barn where the barn cats lived, the porch where she ate popsicles in summer, the driveway where her father taught her to steer the farm, all sitting in his lap. "Daddy, are we going to lose the farm?" Warren knelt down. The heat from the burning house was on his back. His daughter's face was lit orange by the flames. He smelled like smoke and sweat and fear. "No," he said, "we're going to build it back." He didn't know how. He had no plan. He had no money. He had no money. He had a burned tractor and 200 acres of land and a promise to a 7-year-old girl. That promise was worth more than the insurance settlement. Let me tell you what $400 buys when a man has nothing else and everything to prove. Warren took the insurance money, $27,700, and put it in the bank. He didn't touch it. Not a penny. That money was for structures, and structures would come later. First, he had to farm. He had $400 cash, the Farmall 560 with its burned paint and melted seat, and 200 acres of land that still had a crop in the ground, the current year's wheat, planted in October of '70, growing in the field, untouched by the fire. The fire had destroyed the buildings but not the crop. The wheat was still there.
Warren's first act was to fix the Farmall.
He spent $62 on a new wiring harness, a used seat from a neighbor's parts pile, and a can of black spray paint for the worst of the scorched metal. The tractor looked terrible. Mismatched paint, a seat that didn't match the original, bare spots where the old paint had blistered off, but it ran. It pulled. It did the work. His second act was to harvest the wheat. He didn't have a combine. His had burned, so he made a deal with his neighbor Leon Whitfield, who farmed 320 acres to the east. Leon would harvest Warren's wheat with his combine. In exchange, Warren would do custom tillage work for Leon through the fall, plowing, disking, and chisel work with the Farmall. The harvest came in at 31 bushels per acre on the 200 acres. At the current wheat price of $1.52 a bushel, that was $9,424 gross. After paying for seed, fertilizer he'd applied before the fire, and fuel for Leon's combine, Warren netted approximately $7,200 from a crop that the insurance man thought was worthless. Warren put it in the bank alongside the untouched insurance money. His third act was shelter. The family couldn't live in the neighbor's spare room forever. Warren bought a used mobile home, a 1963 model, 12 feet wide, 60 feet long, 3 bedrooms, from a family in York who was upgrading. Price $2,200 from the insurance fund. He had it delivered to the farm and set it on the foundation where the house had stood. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't permanent, but it was theirs. His fourth act was a workshop. He couldn't farm without tools, and he couldn't store tools without a building. He spent a weekend and $300 in lumber, building a 12 by 24 pole shed with a dirt floor, a workbench made from a salvaged door, and hooks on the walls for tools. That was the problem. 30 years of accumulated tools. Wrenches, sockets, screwdrivers, pliers, welding equipment, grease guns, jacks, chains, come-alongs, air compressor, drill press, all of it had burned in the workshop. Replacing it new would have cost $5,000 or more. Warren didn't replace it new. He replaced it the same way he was replacing everything else, one piece at a time, from wherever he could find it cheapest. He went to farm auctions. Not to buy equipment, he couldn't afford equipment, but to buy tool lots. When a farm was auctioned, the tools usually sold as a single lot, a box or a barrel or a toolbox full of mixed hand tools. Nobody bid much on tool lots because the big money was on the tractors and combines. Warren bought tool lots for $5, $10, $15. He drove home with cardboard boxes full of wrenches and pliers and screwdrivers and rebuilt his workshop one auction at a time. By October of '71, 3 months after the fire, Warren had a mobile home, a pole shed workshop, a working Farmall, a basic tool collection, and $11,000 in the bank. He'd spent less than $3,000 of the insurance money. He'd earned $7,000 from the wheat crop, and he hadn't borrowed a dime. The neighbors were watching, not with admiration, not yet. With the uncomfortable mixture of pity and doubt that farm communities feel when a man is doing something that looks brave but might be foolish. They'd seen the ruins, they'd seen the mobile home, they'd seen Warren driving the scorched Farmall down the county road, paint blistered, seat mismatched, looking like a machine that should have been scrapped. Warren Platt is killing himself trying to save a dead farm, they said at the co-op. The insurance man offered him a clean settlement. He should have taken it and moved to town like a sensible person. The J.D. dealer, a man named Floyd Kimball in Geneva, weighed in with the authority of a man who sold new equipment for a living and couldn't understand why anyone would want old equipment, much less burned equipment. Warren's farming with a scorched Farmall and a mobile home, Floyd said. That's not farming. That's camping. Give him a year and he'll be in Geneva looking for a job at the feed mill. Floyd said this in November of '71. Remember that? Because Floyd Kimball was going to eat those words, slowly, over the next 5 years. Now let me tell you about the rebuilding, because this is where $400 becomes a lesson in what a man can do when failure isn't an option. Year 1, '71 into '72, Warren farmed the 200 acres with the Farmall and nothing else. No combine. He traded custom work with Leon again. No grain storage. He sold at harvest, which meant taking whatever price the elevator offered on delivery day. No second tractor. Every job, from plowing to planting to cultivating, was done with the 560. Warren put over 1,400 hours on that tractor in the first year. It never stopped. He changed the oil every 75 hours like clockwork, greased every fitting every morning, and treated the machine with the kind of care a man gives to the last thing standing between him and ruin. The wheat came in at 33 bushels. Net income after costs, $8,100. It went in the bank. The corn he'd planted on the other half of the rotation came in at 89 bushels. Net income, $6,200. Bank. Total first-year net from farming alone, $14,300. He'd also done custom work for 4 neighbors, plowing, disking, planting, earning another $3,800 in cash. End of year 1, $29,000 in the bank, counting the untouched insurance and the farming income. Spent less than $5,000 total on the mobile home, shed, tools, and operating costs. Year 2, '72 into '73, Warren built a barn. Not a new barn. He couldn't afford lumber at those prices. He built a barn from salvage. He bought a tornado-damaged pole building frame from a farm in Saline County for $400. He and Leon spent 3 weekends disassembling it, hauling it to Warren's farm, and re-erecting it on a new concrete pad that Warren poured himself, renting a mixer for $40 a day. The barn cost $2,800 total. Frame, concrete, roofing tin from a demolished grain elevator, sliding doors from a closed dairy operation. It wasn't beautiful. The tin didn't match. The doors were different colors, but it kept the rain off the Farmall and gave Warren a proper shop space. He bought his first piece of new equipment that year, a used grain drill from an auction in Clay County, $450. It had been sitting in a tree line for 2 years, but the working parts were sound. Warren cleaned it, replaced the seed tubes, greased the bearings, and planted his wheat that fall with his own drill for the first time since the fire. Year 3, '73 into '74. Warren bought a used combine, an old Massey Ferguson 35, self-propelled, with a 12-foot header. He found it at an estate auction in Thayer County. The farmer who'd owned it had died, and his family wanted it gone. Warren paid $2,200 cash. The Massey needed work. The reel bearings were shot, the sieves needed replacing, and the engine smoked under load. Warren spent the winter rebuilding it in his salvage barn, using parts he'd found at auctions and scrapyards. Total repair cost, $370. When he harvested his own wheat in July of '74, for the first time in 3 years with his own combine, Warren pulled the Massey into the field and sat in the cab for a full minute before he engaged the header. Not because anything was wrong, because everything was finally right. He was harvesting his own crop, on his own land, with his own machine. 3 years after everything burned, he cried. Alone in the cab. Nobody saw. Nobody needed to. Year 4, '74 into '75. Grain storage. Warren built 2 small grain bins from salvage parts, used corrugated steel panels from a demolished bin in York County, a new auger he bought on sale from a dealer in Hastings, and concrete pads he poured himself. Total cost for both bins, $3,100. Combined capacity 6,000 bushels, half of what he'd lost in the fire, but enough to hold grain for a better price instead of selling at harvest. The bins changed his economics immediately. Instead of selling wheat at harvest for $1.50, he stored it until February and sold for $1.87. That 37-cent difference on 4,000 bushels was an extra $1,480. The bins paid for themselves in 2 years. Year 5, 75 into 76. Warren built the house, not the mobile home. The mobile home was still there and would stay as a guest house. Warren built a real house, a small one. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, kitchen, living room. About 1,100 square feet. Nothing fancy. Pine framing, vinyl siding, asphalt shingles, linoleum floors. He didn't hire a contractor. He did it himself, with help from Leon and 2 other neighbors who owed him custom work hours. They framed it in a week, roofed it in 2 days, and Warren spent the rest of the fall doing the interior wiring, plumbing, drywall, painting. June did the kitchen. Ellie, now 12, painted her own bedroom. She chose yellow. The house cost $11,400 in materials from the insurance fund that Warren had been sitting on for 4 years, waiting for exactly this. He'd planned it from the beginning. Use the farming income for the farm. Save the insurance money for the house. Patient, disciplined, methodical. On Christmas morning of 1975, the Platt family woke up in their own house for the first time in 4.5 years. Ellie ran down the hallway to the kitchen in her socks, the way 12-year-old girls do, and found her father sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking out the window at the farm he'd rebuilt from ashes. "Daddy," she said, "we didn't lose the farm." Warren looked at his daughter, 12 now, taller, still carrying the same stuffed rabbit, though it lived on a shelf instead of in her arms. And he smiled. "No," he said, "we didn't. Let me tell you about Floyd Kimball, because justice delayed is still justice." In the fall of 76, Floyd Kimball, the J.D. dealer who'd said Warren was camping, not farming, drove past Warren's property on the county road. He slowed down. Then he stopped. What he saw was a farm, not a ruin, not a mobile home, and a scorched tractor. A farm. A salvage-built barn, 2 grain bins, a new house, small, white, plain, with a yellow bedroom window on the east side, a workshop, a grain drill, a combine, and the Farmall 560, still burned-looking, still mismatched, still running after 5 years and 6,000 hours of post-fire service. Floyd sat in his truck and stared for a long time. Then he drove to the co-op, where he found Leon Whitfield buying seed. "Leon," Floyd said, "when did Warren Platt rebuild his farm?" "He's been rebuilding it for 5 years, Floyd. You've been driving past it every week." "I didn't notice." "Most people didn't," Leon said. "Warren doesn't make noise. He just works." Floyd was quiet for a moment. "How much did it cost him?" "You'd have to ask him. But I know he didn't borrow $1. Paid cash for everything. Built most of it himself." Floyd Kimball never publicly acknowledged that he'd been wrong about Warren Platt, but he stopped making jokes about burned tractors and mobile homes. And when his own dealership struggled in the early 80s, when the farm crisis hit and nobody was buying new equipment, Floyd found himself thinking about Warren's scorched Farmall more than once, about a man who'd lost everything and rebuilt with nothing, while Floyd's showroom full of expensive machines gathered dust. Let me tell you about the end, because this story has a closing scene that I carry with me. Warren Platt farmed until 1998. He was 65. He'd rebuilt the 200 acres from ashes, expanded to 260, by buying a neighbor's 60 acres in '84, cash no loan, and built a farm that was, by any measure, more valuable than the one that burned. The Farmall 560 never left the property. Warren retired it in '92, 21 years after the fire, 28 years since he'd bought it new. Over its life, it had accumulated 22,000 hours on the meter. The engine had been rebuilt once, in '83. The hydraulics had never been touched. The transmission was original. Warren parked it in the barn, the salvage-built barn, still standing, still mismatched, and hung a small sign on the wall behind it. The sign was a piece of scrap wood with words burned into it with a soldering iron. It read, "This tractor survived the fire of July 4th. So did we." In 2001, Ellie Platt, now Ellie Dressler, married with 2 children of her own, took over the farm. She was 37. She'd gone to college, worked in Lincoln for a decade, and come home because the land pulled her back the way land always does when it's been fought for. On her first morning running the farm alone, Ellie walked to the barn, stood in front of the Farmall 560, and read the sign her father had made. She reached out and put her hand on the tractor's hood, still scarred, still mismatched, still carrying the marks of the worst night of her family's life. She remembered. She remembered the fire. She remembered the pajamas and the rabbit and the heat on her face. She remembered asking her father the question that changed everything. "Daddy, are we going to lose the farm?" She was 7 when she asked it. She was 37 when she answered it, by standing in the barn her father built from salvage, on the farm her father rebuilt from nothing, beside the tractor that survived a fire because a man didn't finish a grease job. Warren Platt died in 2009 at the age of 76. His funeral was held at the church in Geneva. The attendance was larger than anyone expected, over 200 people. Leon Whitfield, now 81, told the story of the fire and the rebuilding to anyone who would listen. Howard Brill, the insurance adjuster, did not attend. Floyd Kimball, the JD dealer, did. He sat in the back row and said nothing. Ellie spoke at the service. She didn't talk about farming or insurance or equipment. She talked about a question and a promise. "When I was 7 years old, I asked my father if we were going to lose the farm. He said no. He had $400, a burned tractor, and no reason to believe he could keep that promise. But he kept it. He kept it with his hands, his back, his patience, and his refusal to accept that losing everything meant losing everything." She paused. "The insurance company said the farm was gone. My father said it wasn't. The neighbors said take the money and move to town. My father said no. The dealer said he was camping, not farming. My father built a house." She held up a small piece of paper, yellowed, creased, old. "This is the receipt for the mobile home my father bought 3 months after the fire. $2,200. Our first home after the fire. I grew up in that mobile home. I did my homework at a folding table in that mobile home, and I never once felt poor, because my father never once acted like we were." She put the receipt down. "My father rebuilt a farm with $400 and a burned tractor. But that's not the story. The story is that he did it because a 7-year-old girl asked him not to quit, and he didn't quit. Not once. Not for 30 years. The church was silent. 200 people, and not a sound. If you're going through something right now that feels like a fire, something that burned everything you had, I want you to know what my father knew. The land is still there. The land doesn't burn. The buildings burn. The equipment burns. The grain burns. But the land, the thing that actually matters, the land is still there when the smoke clears. And if the land is there, you can start again." Ellie farms the 260 acres today. The farm, all 560, sits in the same barn, under the same sign. Her children, 15 and 12, know the story. They know about the fire and the $400 and the grease job that saved the tractor and the question their mother asked at 7 years old. The stuffed rabbit sits on a shelf in Ellie's bedroom. The yellow paint she chose at 12 is still on the walls. And every July 14th, the anniversary of the fire, Ellie walks to the barn, puts her hand on the Farmall's scorched hood, and says the same thing her father said to her in the ashes 40 years ago. "We didn't lose the farm." Sometimes the fire takes everything except the one thing that matters. Sometimes the insurance man is wrong. Sometimes $400 is enough, if the man spending it is the right man. And sometimes the most powerful promise a father can make is the one he makes to a 7-year-old girl standing barefoot in the ashes of the only home she's ever known. Warren Platt kept that promise. The tractor survived. The farm came back. The daughter came home. And the land never burned.